Welcome back to The Battle. I'm Matt Sidholm, and this season, Jenn, Tully, and I are diving into the world of true crime with a battle of songs inspired by true crimes and criminals. Our winner this season was Deep Red Bells by Nico Case, inspired by the Green River Killer. But we've been promising some bonus content for you all season long, and this is the week. Finally, Jenn and I prepared some additional notes. We did a lot of actually prep for all of these songs, and so we figured we'd just compile some of our notes together and go through some of the, I suppose, lowlights, not really highlights, of some of the ones that didn't advance as far. So, Jenn, you want to let's kick it off. Like, what do you got extra for the listeners out there?
Yeah, sure. You know, like you said, we did a lot of digging on all of these songs, all of these criminals, to the point where I think at certain times, some members of my family were a little bit worried about what it was we were actually doing in here, Matt. But I want to go back and revisit one of the very first songs that we spoke about, and it was Shankill Butchers by the Decemberists. This one was, unfortunately, this song didn't advance very far in the competition, but this was just such an interesting kind of case to dive into, because this was about a gang of serial killers, right? This wasn't just one person or one criminal. This was an entire gang supporting a political movement. And I just found that really, unique in terms of, the story of serial killers and some of the other criminals that we looked at. This was a whole gang of people that committed these vicious acts, between 1975 and 1982. Now, of course, it's associated with the Troubles in Northern Ireland. That's a story that's been pretty well told in songs, in movies, in books. But I'd not heard a lot about this particular group of, like I said, this kind of gang of serial killers. And turns out they were the most prolific gang of serial killers in UK history. And so I just found that really amazing that like this whole entire group of people managed to elude, capture. And there were so many other crazy, terrible things happening during the Troubles that these people got away with committing. They killed 22 people during this time frame. And I just thought that was something that was pretty interesting, like to have a whole gang of people that were capable of committing this kind of crime. Now, again, I did say it was politically motivated, and we all know that is that's been an excuse, if nothing else, for centuries of people pushing their values on others or committing atrocities. But this one seemed particularly recent and kind of hard to digest.
Yeah, I agree with you, especially the thought, like you said, of just a gang of people doing this, right? Like, certainly we all know kind of the dangers of groupthink, right? And
Right.
how that can devolve and really lead to some bad results, whether it's in business or sort of political movements, whatever it is. But, in this particular case, murder's such an extreme act.
Yeah.
And to think it wasn't just one or two people, or I just have to think there was one or two people in that group going, hey, this is a little much, right? Like we should dial this back, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. It's obviously an awful time period, but yeah,
Well,
it is interesting to think about a whole group executing that.
I think you're super correct about sort of this group think idea. I know that Lenny Murphy was one of the kids, actually, I can use that word, that was convicted of crimes. And he was 16 when he joined the UVF. A lot of these members of Shankill Butchers were part of the UVF. And they were Protestants that wanted to stay with the UK. Basically, if you know anything, like basic premise of the Troubles is that the Catholics wanted to reunite with Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and the Protestants wanted to stay with the UK, and it caused this, 30-year period that's known as the Troubles. And yeah, he was 16 when he joined the UVF and 20 when he was charged with murder. That's a young person. That's a
Yeah.
16-year-old kid that's getting involved in this. So I think that those were just a couple of things that were left out of the original broadcast that I thought were like, ooh. And again, just because this one is so top of mind, I feel like every year there's a new story that comes out, again, whether it's a book or a movie. And I just recently saw another one that not particularly about the Troubles, but there's a movie that's getting a lot of hype right now called Kneecap. That's about it. It's a Northern Ireland film, and it's about the Northern Irish wanting to be able to speak Irish. And, the Protestants and the ruling class there said, no, you can't. And they basically are fighting for the fact that, like, if you don't have a language, you're not a full country.
Hmm.
And so, like, even as recent as now, I think it was in 2017 that they finally passed the law saying that you could speak Irish in public. But that was a political movement. Like, so much turmoil has been going on. I think it really is a history associated with Northern Ireland. But these are just people that are very fiercely proud of who they are and where they came from and have strong beliefs. And, I think in the version of Kneecap, they took something like rap music, like rapping in Irish, to make a political statement, which is obviously a much stronger choice than gang murdering 22 people to support your cause. But again, in the spirit of, like, we're talking about these things in hopes that they don't happen again, to me, that's a sign that we've moved from, between 75 and 82 people being murdered. And now, we can watch a movie about, people using music to share their story and make a point rather than violence.
Yeah, no, we definitely much prefer that here on the Super Awesome Mix podcast network.
Exactly.
Let's use music and not violence.
Always. That should be our tagline. Music, not violence.
Music, not violence. Yes, that'll catch on. Well, I wanted to catch everyone up. I highlighted a song called Leeds United by Luke Haines early on, and it was inspired by what was dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper. Peter Sutcliffe was his real name, and he killed 13 people in the late 60s and early 70s. And I mean, really violent crimes, like would hit these women with a hammer first and kind of knock them out, then kind of beat them to death. There were stabbings, just awful crimes. But Peter Sutcliffe died in 2020, and there were a number of articles written about that time about him and his legacy. They had spent 2.5 million hours investigating his crimes. And what the articles came out with was just a lot of things highlighting the police's failures during this time, and actually their motivation to kind of follow a new lead or a new clue. Sutcliffe himself was interviewed by the police 9 times before finally being caught. So he was arrested 9 times, interviewed 9 times, and let go before he was finally caught. In one of them, they actually showed him a picture of the boots that he was wearing in the room with them. And somehow nobody in the room noticed, like, hey, those are the same boots. And It's like, nowadays, like the shoes people would zero in immediately on the shoes, So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, and it was about the same time period as the Green River Killer, obviously thousands of miles apart from each other. And given that there was no internet, and who knows what the news cycle was internationally, they probably had not heard of the other, but they were both sort of executing these awful violent crimes against women. And so it's like, it was odd that we had these sort of parallel, somewhat copycat killers across the world from each other about the same time, but probably zero connection to each other. But it was just interesting as I sort of pieced together the timeline of this one. And obviously the Green River Killer went far, all the way to the to winning the bracket here. So when we learn more about that, it's just, I don't know, and just horrible things, horrible people, and it's just terrible. But in this case, I think the legacy was, sort of the police work that was done, and how that was kind of, stepped up, and like, now it's like a little more pressure on detectives, both probably privately and publicly, to do a little more in cases like these, and not just sort of let it go, because it was over multiple years that he kind of had a little bit of a reign of terror.
Well, and that was something that I noticed throughout this series. A lot of times the detectives really were like the unsung heroes in some of these stories. I mean, you saw people that got so wrapped up in it that they literally like gave their lives over to solving these crimes. I think, Reichert comes to mind when we talk about the Green River Killer. The entire New York City police force during Summer of Sam. And then there were some misses as well. I think there were criminals that eluded capture for many years. That was another note that I made on here. Out of all of these stories that we covered, Zodiac is the only killer that's never been identified. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we still don't know who that is. And that's not by lack of, police work. There have been so many investigators, local, federal, trying to solve this crime for so many years. And even with all the advancements in DNA and genealogy tracking, that's kind of a hot word now, is all of the, the things they're able to do with people that are submitting samples to like 23andMe and, things like that to learn about their
Mm-hmm.
heritage.
Yeah.
That's been a great resource to police forces in tracking down criminals. But still, just the fact that like so many of these people really like dedicated their lives to solving some of these crimes, and how wrapped up they got in these cases, that was just something that I wasn't aware of until I really dug into a lot of these stories.
I would imagine that certainly now that I have kids, like if I heard about something like this going on, if I was in that sort of position, I mean, I kind of get it. Like it would just be hard to sleep thinking, okay, I got to get up and find this person before something else horrible happens to someone, right? Like these are such horrific crimes that we kind of talked about this season, that to think, all right, well, I guess I'll just go to bed or I'll just go see some friends and relax. Like, I just think it would be impossible. So I
Yeah.
get how they would get obsessed with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll get to this, and like you said, we covered quite a lot of the Green River Killer. But like, just back to Dave Reichert, I can remember reading in one of my, when we were researching that, he was a new detective. He was 31 years old, and he just kind of happened to get called to the first murder scene, and then 2 days later, they start finding other bodies, and it was his daughter's birthday. She was like,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was like her 7th or 8th birthday, right? Like, how about driving the message home? Like, you're getting called, all these bodies are popping up in your town of young women, and it's your young daughter's birthday. Like,
Yeah.
how could you not
Yeah,
work
how could you
day and
not?
night?
Right. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. How could you not just, you know what, I'm gonna stick around here. I'll skip the party and see if I can't make a little headway here, because I'm not letting this happen to my daughter or any of her friends or whatever the case may be. I mean, it's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, moving along to another killer that didn't make it as far in our brackets as I kind of thought that they would. But I had some interesting facts that I wasn't able to share on the episode where we talked about What Will Happen, Will Happen, the Lemon Demon song about Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. Ted Kaczynski, it's funny, like there have been a lot of people, I think they've disproved it pretty wholeheartedly at this point, but thought that Kaczynski was kind of the reemergence and reimagining of Zodiac. There was a time period, and I didn't know this until I started doing research for the episode, but there was a time period where that's what they thought. I guess it's not strange sometimes for serial killers to go dark for a while and then come back in sort of like a reimagined space. And so there were a lot of folks that thought maybe Ted Kaczynski was also Zodiac. They both were into writing manifestos. They were both into, toying with the press and forcing them to publish their letters, or threatening to kill other people. They had they were articulate, although there were, spelling errors and things like that in Zodiac's letters to the press, he did develop these very sophisticated ciphers. So they were both intelligent men. But something that I thought was interesting, and again, going back to kind of being surprised by the level of police work and personal involvement that a lot of these detectives had, I started thinking about like the choices that people had to make whenever they were getting these letters. Like, what do? Do you give oxygen to these serial killers that are obviously disturbed and put this really disturbing information out to the public? Or do you risk them, delivering on their promise to kill more people if you don't? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I spent some time sort of sitting with that too, like as a newspaper editor, like, what do you do in terms of, Kaczynski and his manifesto? It was 35,000 words,
Yeah.
right? That's not a short thing to print. And, it was a supplement to the Washington Post. And at the time, Janet Reno was the attorney general. I mean, can you imagine like having to make this decision? Like, are we going to do this? Are we not? Like, are we going to print this giant piece of I mean, crazy town is probably not a very fair thing to say. He certainly, believed in what he was saying, but
There had
how
to
do
have
you
been a couple of lucent points amidst 35,000 words, right? Just law of large numbers would be like, okay, maybe there's a couple relevant things in there. But yeah, you're right. I don't know if you're in that position at a news desk, whether it's print or, otherwise. Like, how do you make that decision? How seriously do you take it? Because I would imagine you get a lot of nut jobs reaching out to you. So it's
Yeah.
like, how do you say, like, well, now let's take this one seriously versus somebody else who's not? And then obviously in Kaczynski's case, he made it known that he was very serious about it and he did take actions. But I mean, I don't know how many of these they're receiving and how many they would necessarily sort of be like, okay, I need to pay attention to this one, or we need to, listen into this one a little bit more closely.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, especially like it also struck me, this time that we're in now where, social media is now not regulating hate speech. You can kind of get on and say whatever you want. It makes me think like, wow, what kind of doors is that going to open for this sort of thing? And then this was another just interesting tidbit about Kaczynski that I was reading. His actions were generally condemned. His manifesto expressed ideas that were, like you said, in some parts cuckoo, in some parts really coherent and relevant. And in 2017, there was a Rolling Stone article that stated that Kaczynski was an early adopter of the concept that we give up a piece of ourselves whenever we adjust to conform to society's standards. That, and we're too plugged in. We're letting technology take over our lives willingly, right? Like, so he's coming out with this statement about, industrialized society and anti-technology. And like, here we are now, right? Technology kind of has taken over our lives. I'm not saying like, yes, we should all go back and revisit and like resurrect Kaczynski, but I'm saying that like,
Well, no, I think you're 100% right. And I mean, he wrote that, what, 15, 20 years before the iPhone, right?
Oh
Like
yeah.
before
Yeah,
that, like
yeah.
even the nascent version of the iPhone, which doesn't do nearly as much as it does now. And yeah, I mean, that's one where it's like, yeah, he's 100% right. Like we're completely, like you just look around at an airport or anything and everybody's just head down in their phone, right? And I'm not
All
trying
the
to say I'm
time.
any better, right? So this isn't something where I've somehow figured this out, and I elude this as well. um, I'm less on social media and more just, doing crossword puzzles, but still staring at my phone, right? But it's one of these things where, yeah, it's like amidst the madness, there is something where it's like, oh, okay, well now hold on, right? And that was some of which, you saw a little bit of that, and we didn't have 35,000 words to go through, but with the United Healthcare CEO that was murdered, some of the articles that came out were like, this is awful, this is awful, this is awful. However, we do have a problem with healthcare in this country, right? And they would kind of point this out of like, again, I don't think the reporters were trying to empathize with the killer, but at the same time, just sort of understanding where the killer might have been coming from with the frustration over it. And I think it's kind of the same thing with the part that you quoted from Kaczynski, where it's like, we're not trying to say anything this guy did was right. But in that statement, it's hard to sit here and go, yeah, there's nothing there. We're moving on.
Yeah, and just the fact that what struck me was too that we're giving it over willingly, right?
Yes.
Like we're doing all of this of our own volition, and it sort of feels like this fast moving train that you can't get off of until it's too late. So I found that really interesting. That caused me to sort of like go back and look at the Kaczynski story a little bit differently, and take different parts of industrial society and its future, which was the name of his manifesto from 95, like, and just kind of think about like, ooh, like, I hope we're not in some sort of like Nostradamus situation here where he's like, we thought he was crazy, but
Maybe we should have been listening. Maybe we
right,
should have
maybe we
been
should have paid a
listening.
little more attention.
Well, speaking of things that have occurred in the past that maybe were an omen of things to come, I want to go back to a song called I Don't Like Mondays by Boomtown Rats. And the song came out in 1979, and it was about a school shooting. in San Diego, California. 16-year-old girl, Brenda Spencer, lived across the street, just decided she was going to shoot up the school one day and started shooting from across the street. Killed a couple people in the process. She's been in prison ever since, and has a parole hearing actually coming up this year. But just to kind of update that story, it actually came up in the news recently because I think in December or late November, there was a school shooting in Wisconsin that was carried out by a 15-year-old girl.
Oh.
And so they brought up this shooting, Brenda Spencer, because, and I looked this up, per the Justice Department, 97.7% of mass shootings from 1966 to 2019 were perpetrated by men.
Yeah.
And so it is a rarity for something like this to occur from women. And so that's the reason her name was evoked when this school shooting happened back in December. So, they claim, some people claim that this is a result of the fact that, women don't necessarily see themselves, as killers, right? Because so many are done by men. There's less of the copycat, if you will, phenomenon there. Jen, I think you'll agree with me. This is probably a situation where representation is less important. Would you agree with me there?
Yeah, I'm real happy that we're not, bringing up the stats for ladies in the serial killing business.
So just kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know. It just was in the news and just wanted to highlight that, and just sort of I just couldn't believe that number. I mean, actually it was believable, but just that it's so high, 97.7%. And then there's this 2.3% that's carried out by girls and women, these mass shootings. But I mean, hopefully we can, I don't know, just start to lower all the numbers regardless of the gender.
Yeah. Well, and it was interesting too. As songs went further and we're trying to dig deeper for more resources, I came across this. It's actually a pretty ridiculous show. It's called Very Scary People, hosted by Donnie Wahlberg on Investigation Discovery.
Well, I'm in on all that.
There you go. It's really funny because he does like this intro in like this scary, dark hallway before he introduces the story. And he's like, I'm Donnie Wahlberg. And he says it like he's super disappointed in himself. Like every time I started calling my husband and I'm like, you got to watch this intro. It's hilarious. But anyway, that aside.
He does a real deep exhale before.
Yeah. I used to be in New Kids on the Block. Yeah. I'm like, my brother's Mark. He's kind of hotter.
I did 200 episodes of Blue Bloods. You haven't seen any of them. Anyway, but he's very resigned in the intro.
But if this sort of thing is your bag, they cover a lot of the folks that we've talked about here. There's an episode about Berkowitz. There's a Zodiac episode. There's a John Wayne Gacy Jr. episode. They cover a lot of the folks that featured in this season, and they do it in two parts. So they do a Manson episode. So you get a kind of a how the crime was committed and a little backstory on the criminal, and then kind of, their capture and conviction and all of those things. So that's sort of an interesting show, but it made me think of it when you were talking about the stats, male versus female. But they have an Elaine Wuornos, that was made famous in the movie Monster, where Charlize Theron portrayed her. And that's why she eluded capture for so long, is they didn't realize they were looking for a woman. They thought there's no way a woman could be committing these crimes. And so she got off scot-free for a long time because they weren't looking for a woman at all. Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I think to sort of round out our bonus episode here, the last criminal and crime that I'll speak on is back when we talked about a song called Maxwell Murder by Rancid, which is about Jack the Ripper. And I actually misspoke earlier in the episode when I said Zodiac is the only serial killer that we spoke about that had never been caught. Also, Jack the Ripper. They never positively ID'd or caught anybody. And now, there's so much lore and urban legend around the story that murders that he may or may not have committed have been attributed to him. It might have been more than one person. Like, they don't really know. So in a series where we talk about, DNA and the advances in technology and excellent police work and all of these things, like, I would say Jack the Ripper was kind of the early days Zodiac, like, Scotland Yard, everyone was involved involved in trying to figure out who was committing these crimes. And, it was a very similar pattern that we see in later years where he was preying on women, he was preying on prostitutes, people that were sort of seen as disposable by society. And so, yeah, he was kind of, I started noticing the parallels between between Jack the Ripper and Zodiac. And he definitely was never caught. And like Zodiac, also used the press to sort of publicize himself. That was another sort of, trope is probably the wrong word, but that was something that I noticed too as like a common thread through all of these, how people did use media and the press to kind of get word out about these atrocious crimes they were committing. And you don't ever know really if it's for the notoriety, if it's a true warning, if they want to get caught, if it's a mixture of all of it. Like I found that really fascinating to look at as well.
Yeah, I think there's always an element, you hear this a lot, where it's like, oh, they wanted to get caught. Like they got sloppy after a while. Like in a lot of movies and TV shows, they kind of allude to that quite a bit when it comes to sort of serial criminals, not even necessarily killers, but just over time. But yeah, it would be interesting to see like kind of what was the point, because obviously Kaczynski had a larger manifesto he was trying to get out there. But in the case of Jack the Ripper, it's like it kind of leave
nobody
clues,
knows who he
but
is.
nobody knows who he is. But also, and the same thing with Zodiac, he wasn't like
Right.
making a point, right? Like it wasn't like these things were designed to kind of be like, it was almost just taunting, right? It was much
Yeah.
more, it was much crueler in that sense.
Yeah, it was not politically motivated like a,
Yeah.
Shankill Butchers or even like a Kaczynski, right? Like this was just they were random acts of violence against very vulnerable people in society, and they never got caught. So why did they want the publicity? For their own personal gain? Was it a game? Was it a battle of wits? Like, I don't know.
Also really interesting, like we only have one real like big Zodiac movie.
Yeah.
And then there have been several Jack the Ripper movies.
Yeah.
And to your point, it was so long ago, and the evidence, like sort of, we don't even know how many victims there were in that particular case, and especially because he was never caught. But it's like over time, this has just morphed into its own thing. It's like you would almost think down the line, someone's going to think Jack the Ripper was almost something out of a novel
Right.
that has just been sort of reused over time for these different movies and not like an actual thing that occurred. So yeah, really kind of interesting there. Well, speaking of Zodiac, that was kind of my last entry here. Okay, we use the song Macabre, or I'm sorry, Zodiac by Macabre.
Yep.
Really hardcore kind of metal song, and as we've said, Zodiac was never caught. He had these ciphers that he would send to the media, and only one of them was ever cracked. And it's really kind of interesting because they've spent so much time trying to crack them. And even with today's computing ability, they still haven't been able to really break through. In 2021, there was a group called the Case Breakers that tried to solve this case. They identified a guy named Gary Francis Post as the Zodiac killer. But there wasn't a lot of conclusive evidence. It was a lot of just sort of kind of coincidental, like kind of fit this profile they had sort of built at that point. Feels like this could have worked. Now, Post was arrested. Now, he was not a great guy. Arrested in 2016 on a domestic violence charge. He would eventually die in 2018 at the age of 80. There were a handful of other people that were sort of pointed out as potentially the Zodiac killer. The last, the most maybe famous one, Earl Van Best Jr., had a book written by one of his children, Gary Stewart, that claimed that
Yeah.
he was the case. I think it was called like The Most Dangerous Animal or something like that.
Yep.
And so there was a little bit of press about that because this guy was coming out and saying like this was my father. So really, really pretty interesting there. The other thing, going back to the ciphers, is they don't even know what they're looking for necessarily when they're trying to crack these codes. And obviously it's been 40 years now, 50 years. So, and you're dealing with a crazy person, right? Like we said before, this wasn't like politically motivated. He wasn't trying to make some sort of statement. So I imagine if you sent me a code by someone who's out of their mind, like what would I even be looking for from a pattern standpoint to try to break it down? And I think
Right.
that's partially why these have never been cracked. It's interesting. I don't know if you recall, because it was kind of a big media thing in the early 2000s. There was a book called The Bible Code, where they kind of looked at the Bible in its original Aramaic language, and they kind of treated it like a word search, where they would find
Mm.
these words sort of bunched together that were related to kind of a news story, right? That had maybe occurred. So, it was right after 9/11. So they talked about, there were several words involving like towers and crime, like kind of bunched up. And so if you Google this, you could probably find it. The tricky thing about something like the Bible Code, right, and the sort of the fault in the premise, if you will, is that if I don't know what I'm looking for, how am I supposed to find it, right? Like
Right.
it can only really be used in retrospect. Now, I could certainly look for words like stock market crash or something, but like, why would the original Aramaic have that? And if it
Right.
did, is that just circumstantial, right? Like, it was just really it was interesting for what it was, right? Like kind of this interesting language study, but couldn't necessarily be used as a predictor. And I bring up all that because in these ciphers, it's like, unless I kind of know what this guy's going for, what he's doing, it makes it really difficult to break down, right? Like if you just have a blank crossword puzzle, right? It's kind
Yeah.
of hard to fill in. And
Well,
so,
and is there any meaning at all, right? Like
right.
you said, there's no political motivation, there's no religious motivation, there's no desire for notoriety in the sense that he's never been caught. So nobody, like, he's not getting credit for any of this anyway. So, like, yes, I feel like I would get it and be like, nonsense. It's nonsense. He's toying with us. Like I
Yeah.
would just want to put it away. Yet it's still something that we talk about over and over again. And they spend a lot of time. Donnie Wahlberg spends a lot of time
Mm.
talking about
I got to
that.
check out this show. I got my new sort of binge watch, I think, set for me. All right. Well, folks, there you have it. This is our last episode of season 2 of The Battle. A little bonus information for you on some of the participants we had in season 2 of The Battle, all about true crimes and true criminals. Jen and I are already talking about season 3. I think we've got a great idea. So we're really excited to announce that and come out with that later in 2025. But thank you guys for listening. Follow us at Super Awesome Mix. Rate, review the show, share it with your friends so more people can listen. And let us know if we missed anything, of course, on social media. So for Jen, this is Matt, and we'll see you in season 3.